Imagine the sound, the deafening crack of whips driving millions of conscripted peasants forward, the terrifying thud of bodies collapsing from exhaustion along 13,000 miles of impossible terrain, the whispered prayers of dying men whose bones would become the foundation of the world's greatest construction project. This is not some ancient engineering challenge. This is the brutal reality of why the Great Wall can never be recreated. Not because we lack the technology, but because we cannot replicate the unrepeatable convergence of imperial desperation and human sacrifice that made it possible. We have all heard stories of impossible construction projects, but what the Great Wall reveals is something else entirely. The impossibility lies not in moving stones or building walls. It lies in recreating the moral and logistical context that turned millions of human lives into expendable construction materials. You think modern engineering can build anything with enough money? The Great Wall would bankrupt nations and destroy governments before the first mile was completed. Behind this image of ancient stone and mortar lay a construction process so demanding, so brutally wasteful of human life, that it could only exist under conditions that modern civilization will never accept. This wasn't just construction, it was systematic human sacrifice disguised as engineering. A coordinated approach to building that treated human lives as renewable resources and death as an acceptable cost of imperial ambition. Today, we're diving into the brutal truth of why the Great Wall is truly impossible to recreate, not because of technical challenges, but because the human engine that built it cannot be legally, morally, or logistically recreated in the modern world. This is the story of the construction project that consumed civilizations. The human engine, millions of the expendable. But here's what most people don't realize about the Great Wall's construction workforce. They weren't employees or contractors. They were millions of forced laborers driven by imperial decree under conditions that would constitute crimes against humanity by any modern standard. Picture the systematic brutality. Over 2 million soldiers, conscripted peasants, and prisoners working simultaneously across thousands of miles of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. This wasn't a construction project. It was mobilized slavery on a scale that has never been matched in human history. But here's where it gets insane. The workforce wasn't just large, it was expendable. Chinese historical records describe construction zones where workers died faster than they could be replaced, with new conscripts arriving daily to step over the bodies of those who had collapsed the day before. Archaeological evidence reveals mass burial sites along the wall's route containing hundreds of thousands of skeletons, proof that the construction process literally consumed entire populations to achieve its goals. The real impossibility lies in the motivational framework. These workers weren't motivated by wages or career advancement. They were driven by existential terror, the fear of nomadic invasions that made death from construction seem preferable to death from barbarian raids. Modern labor laws, human rights standards, and safety regulations make such massive forced mobilization a legal and ethical impossibility. No modern government could conscript millions of workers and march them to their deaths for a construction project. But here's what's truly terrifying about the scale. It wasn't just the number of workers. It was the systematic replacement system that could continuously supply fresh laborers as the previous ones died from exhaustion, disease, and starvation. Get this, the death toll wasn't accidental. It was systematically calculated as an acceptable operational cost. Chinese military records describe commanders who planned construction schedules based on expected mortality rates, factoring worker deaths into their logistical calculations like any other resource consumption. Imagine the psychological framework required. Supervisors who could watch thousands of workers die and simply requisition more. A governmental system that could treat human life as literally renewable. An imperial ideology that made mass death seem not just acceptable, but heroic in service of collective defense. Archaeological analysis reveals construction sites where workers who collapsed were often buried directly into the wall's foundation rather than being given proper burial. Proof that human remains became literal building materials in the world's largest construction project. The real horror wasn't in the individual deaths. It was in the systematic dehumanization that made millions of deaths seem like routine construction costs rather than an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe. Chinese military records describe the wall's construction as the Great Grinding Machine. Recognition that they had created a system that could transform unlimited human lives into stone and mortar with industrial efficiency. The sound was like a funeral march stretching across continents, the systematic consumption of human life in service of an engineering project that valued imperial security above individual survival. The logistical nightmare. Defying terrain, get this. The wall's route wasn't chosen for convenience. It was deliberately built across the most brutal, inhospitable terrain in China, specifically because that terrain would make invasion impossible, which also made construction a logistical nightmare that defies modern engineering capabilities. Imagine the systematic insanity. 13,000 miles of wall snaking over jagged mountain ridges, through waterless deserts, across steep gorges, and along cliff faces so treacherous that modern heavy machinery couldn't reach them, let alone operate effectively. Picture the supply chain catastrophe. Every stone, every bag of mortar, every tool had to be carried by human labor across terrain that would challenge modern military logistics. There were no roads, no mechanized transport, no industrial supply networks, just millions of people carrying materials on their backs across impossible distances. But here's where it gets insane. The wall wasn't built with standardized modern materials. It was constructed using hyper-local, low-tech materials, rammed earth in the West, local stone wherever available, and the famous sticky rice mortar that required manual preparation at each construction site. Archaeological analysis reveals construction techniques that vary dramatically based on local conditions, proof that the wall was essentially thousands of separate construction projects unified only by their shared impossibility. The real nightmare is the authentic replication requirement. Using modern concrete and steel would create a wall, but not the wall. Authentic recreation would require manually pounding earth and producing non-industrial mortar across the entire route, an economic absurdity that would consume more resources than most nations possess. But here's what's truly shocking about the material challenge. The sticky rice mortar wasn't just a building material. It was advanced chemistry performed by illiterate peasants who understood the molecular properties of calcium carbonate and organic polymers without knowing the scientific principles involved. Modern construction relies on mechanized transport, standardized materials, and industrial supply chains. The wall's route was specifically chosen to make all of these impossible, creating a construction challenge that becomes more difficult with modern methods, not easier. Picture the transportation nightmare. Modern heavy equipment that could speed construction cannot navigate the mountain passes and desert terrain where the wall was built. Helicopters and aircraft could transport materials, but at costs that would exceed the GDP of most nations for a single mile of authentic construction. The supply chain impossibility extends beyond just moving materials. The wall required continuous resupply of food, water, tools, and replacement workers across thousands of miles of terrain that lacked any existing infrastructure. But here's where it gets truly insane. Even the Chinese government, with unlimited political authority and massive resources, has never attempted to rebuild damaged sections using authentic historical methods. They use modern techniques because the original methods are simply too demanding. Chinese engineering records describe the wall's construction as building in hell, recognition that they had chosen to construct the world's largest building project in locations specifically selected to be unconquerable by normal means. The sound was like machinery breaking against stone, the systematic failure of every logistical system when confronted with terrain that was designed to defeat organized human effort. The ultimate impossibility, moral and political price. Here's where it gets insane. The wall wasn't just a construction project. It was the ultimate expression of imperial desperation backed by absolute political authority that could sacrifice unlimited human lives without accountability or opposition. Picture the political framework that made the wall possible. An autocratic emperor who could conscript entire populations, seize unlimited resources, and execute anyone who questioned the project's necessity or cost. This wasn't democratic decision-making. It was imperial decree backed by the threat of death. Imagine trying to recreate this political context in the modern world, securing land rights across 13,000 miles, navigating environmental regulations in multiple jurisdictions, obtaining construction permits from hundreds of local authorities, and managing the bureaucratic nightmare of international coordination. But here's what's truly terrifying about the political impossibility. The wall required not just political authority, but ideological necessity. The original builders believed they were constructing the ultimate barrier between civilization and chaos, between the civilized world and barbarian destruction. Modern democratic governments cannot conscript millions of workers, seize unlimited private property, or ignore environmental and safety regulations for construction projects. The political mechanisms that made the wall possible are incompatible with modern governance. But the ultimate impossibility isn't just political, it's moral. The Great Wall was built using methods that modern civilization recognizes as fundamentally evil, making authentic recreation not just difficult, but ethically unthinkable. Picture the systematic horror. Workers who collapsed from exhaustion were often buried directly into the wall's foundation, rather than being given proper burial. Families were separated permanently as conscripts were marched to construction sites they would never leave alive. Imagine the human cost calculation. Chinese historical records suggest that over 1 million people died during the wall's construction, a death toll that represents one of the largest construction-related deaths in human history. But here's where it gets insane. The high death toll wasn't accidental. It was systematically accepted as the necessary cost of imperial security. The wall's builders understood that millions would die and proceeded anyway because they believed the alternative was worse. The real moral impossibility lies in the philosophical framework. The wall was built by civilizations that believed collective security justified unlimited individual sacrifice. A moral calculation that modern human rights standards make literally unthinkable. Modern construction projects are abandoned or redesigned when worker death tolls reach double digits. The Great Wall required accepting death tolls in the hundreds of thousands as routine operational costs. But here's what's truly shocking. Even if we could overcome every technical, political, and moral obstacle, we still couldn't recreate the Great Wall because we cannot recreate the existential necessity that made its construction seem rational rather than insane. Picture the psychological context. The wall was built by people who believed they faced literal extinction from nomadic invasions. Every stone was placed by workers who understood that failure meant the complete destruction of their civilization, their families, and their way of life. Imagine trying to recreate that level of existential terror in the modern world. What threat could possibly justify conscripting millions of workers and accepting hundreds of thousands of deaths for a single construction project? The wall wasn't just built to stop invasions. It was built to prove that Chinese civilization possessed the will and capability to undertake impossible projects in service of collective survival. Modern threats, terrorism, cyber warfare, economic competition, don't create the kind of existential terror that could justify wall-scale human sacrifice. We lack the motivational framework that made the original construction psychologically possible. The real impossibility lies in recreating the cultural context where such massive sacrifice could seem not just acceptable, but heroic and necessary for civilizational survival. Chinese cultural records describe the wall as the monument to impossible will, recognition that they had created something that transcended practical necessity and became a demonstration of what human societies could achieve when survival itself was at stake. The sound was like history itself closing a door, the recognition that some human achievements can never be repeated because the conditions that made them possible can never be recreated. The Great Wall cannot be recreated because it was never just a construction project. It was the product of an unrepeatable convergence of imperial desperation, unlimited political authority, and existential necessity that modern civilization cannot and will not recreate. This wasn't about engineering capability. It was about the human cost that modern societies refuse to pay and the moral calculations that modern ethics reject as fundamentally evil. The Chinese approach required treating human life as expendable, individual rights as irrelevant, and collective survival as worth any price. These conditions cannot be recreated because we have evolved beyond the moral framework that made them possible. So the next time you see the Great Wall, remember that you're looking at something truly impossible, not because we lack the technology to build it, but because we lack the willingness to sacrifice millions of lives to prove our civilizational determination. The Great Wall stands alone in history because the human engine that built it can never be rebuilt.